I'm Keegan McBride. I'm a lecturer in AI government and policy at the University of Oxford, and I'm also an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security in Technology and National Security. Uh, the white paper is looking at the resilience of digital states. And I think basically what we wanted to highlight is that the COVID-19 pandemic sort of exposed a lot of weaknesses in many governments' crisis management plans. Uh, they might have plans that would help them sort of in a 24, 48-hour period, maybe a week. But what we see is the world is actually becoming increasingly defined by crises, and they're more severe, they're more in number, they're more interconnected, they're bigger in scale, they're lasting longer. And so what we wanted to explore was how can governments make themselves more resilient during these times of crisis? And we know from the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic that technology is going to play a critical role. But the problem is, one, most governments just aren't ready from a technological perspective. But two, as you become more digital, it also builds in new sorts of vulnerabilities and threats to the resilience of the state. So what myself and the co-authors tried to do was think through how can you overcome some of these sorts of things up to the point of, what would it mean to make a state so digitally resilient that even if it lost some of its physical territory for a period of time, be that, 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, that you could still more or less continue to function and run the state digitally. So essentially what our paper tries to do is draw attention to the fact that the services that you need for running the state during sort of normal, peaceful times, sort of standard operating conditions, are not the same services that you might need during a time of crisis. So, as an example, during sort of more normal operating conditions, maybe it's very effective and important services are the collection of taxes, something like the register of marriages, and these sorts of services that you can do digitally. When you're thinking about a time of crisis, particularly, in a time of crisis where you don't have access to your physical territory, either because of occupation or it's been disrupted due to a natural disaster or something like that, the services that you actually want to work aren't necessarily the same. So in times of crisis, the importance of, let's say, maintaining your culture and heritage, the importance of archives, the importance of education, these all go up like very quickly compared to other sorts of services. I think this is what we wanted to draw attention to, is that while most of the government digitalization is happening from this perspective that everything's going to sort of continue in normal conditions and everything's going to be fine and there's going to be all these efficiency and effectiveness gains, that might not always be the case. And so it's really important for governments to understand that if they were to react to a crisis or encounter a crisis, what are the services that become critical? And almost certainly they're not going to be the ones that are typically viewed as critical to the functioning of the state. Many governments want to have their own data and their own infrastructure and their own services and have everything based within their own territory. And to some extent, I think that makes sense. If you're a large country, you have a large population, you will be sort of more immune to some of the disasters that might be more influential for sort of smaller states. That being said, there are examples of countries that have had their critical services disrupted because of a natural disaster like a flood or a forest fire. And what we do see is that these are on the rise. And so while it's understandable to want everything to be on your own territory, this is representative of a sort of physical single point of failure in a way. So if you want to become more resilient, I think it's important for states and governments to sort of start thinking about what it might look like to, be able to have some of their data stored on servers outside of their borders. Maybe not permanently, but like as an example, Estonia does this with the data embassy, where they're backing up critical records of the government to an actual embassy, essentially a server, so that if their services were to be disrupted, they can actually just pull straight from that. And I think we're going to see a lot of movement in this direction. You don't need to go totally crazy at the beginning and start thinking about this internationally, but you could also think about working in sort of more regional alliances, also things like NATO or the EU. There perhaps is an easier way to sort of get around this. I just mentioned the data embassy, and I think this is the first step, but it's probably not enough. And the reason for this is that it's important to have backups of your sort of critical government data sets. The UK, for example, has had plenty of disruptions due to ransomware, stuff like that. If this sort of hits a critical asset for the state, there's going to be big problems if you don't have backups. But we wanted to push this even further than just backing up data and ask the question of what would it mean if you could actually run, the state from a sort of from the cloud that's based in, another country's territory. And I think this is the direction that we would like to see, is this movement from, basically this decoupling of a state's digital government from its physical territory up to the point where you would have these digital or cloud embassies that would facilitate, being able to run the state digitally from the territory of another country. Obviously, this requires a lot of legal negotiation and policy development and stuff like that. But from a technological standpoint, it's certainly possible. And there are huge benefits related to this, particularly around sort of collective security and guaranteeing the, digital longevity and continuity of the state. And in many ways, we actually see this in Ukraine, which at the start of the sort of renewed war, when the city was encircled, there was a huge effort to bring Ukraine's government data assets outside of their borders. And to this day, you have a lot of Ukrainian governments sort of working with cloud providers, amongst other sorts of stakeholders, to facilitate and run their, increasingly world-leading digital government. The fact that these regulations provide the framework for you to facilitate the sort of sharing of data. I don't think we have a legal framework that gets as far as, what we need today in order to sort of enable this. Like there needs to be a lot more negotiation and development. Probably the current situation would be a little bit against this. But I think in the long run, there's going to have to be a change, and not sort of keeping up with the way that the world's technological development is going to lead to some potentially, bad consequences and almost certainly have some long-term implications for a state's digital resiliency. In the report, we talk about different sorts of drivers and policy considerations. One being the digital embassy, and, moving towards the cloud, identifying critical services, some of these things that we talked about, but also key to building sort of digitally resilient states will be, ensuring connectivity, because it doesn't really matter if all of this stuff is digitalized if people can't interact with it. So subsea internet cables are incredibly vulnerable. We've seen them being cut in the recent weeks. That's going to continue to happen. In times of conflict, that's absolutely a threat. During natural disasters, there can also be disruptions to communications networks. So I think what's important is, one, to sort of ensure redundancy. So this might be opening up the market, ensuring competition, making sure there's multiple different ways to access the internet. So this might be engaging with companies like Starlink or their competitors, sort of like satellite-based internet provision. For telecommunications providers, there's also this importance of also building in resiliency and communication between them. So let's say the infrastructure of one provider goes down, being able to share the load with the others, making sure they're able to cooperate with one another, and just trying to sort of build resiliency and eliminate single points of failures throughout the stack. Recently in Denmark, for example, one major telecom provider went down and had huge run-on implications. And so I think this is what we want to sort of draw attention to, particularly if you're thinking about a crisis lasting for longer than sort of, 24 hours, but going into the weeks, months, years, multiple years perspective. What's particularly cool about this piece is it's like the cooperation of academia, industry, and government. So we had, high-ranking folks from the Estonian government to work on this with myself from Oxford and with this consultancy company. And we presented it at Tallinn Digital Summit, which is this big digital summit in Estonia every year. And the reaction was quite good, but certainly Estonia continues to be sort of at the forefront of some of this stuff.